Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 483. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I'm sure, as you all expect, we will have news on the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel on today's show. So if you could share the show, it's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. You could listen to all the shows in audio form anywhere you can listen to podcasts, and then follow me because I put out a lot more than just these shows. I write articles nearly every day, either for the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com, and all of those can be found on any of my social media handles. On Twitter, that's Kyle _. On Facebook, it's just my name, Kyle Anzalone. You could go ahead, either follow me, add me as a friend, and you'll be able to see my content that way. And also on Instagram at Kyle Anzalone3. All right, here we go. First story up on today's show, just a couple things on the war in Ukraine today. Growing number of Ukrainians opposed to fighting one diplomatic end to the war. All right, so I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on October 9th. A recent poll found that the number of Ukrainians who want to fight Russia until the end of the war has fallen to 60%. President Zelensky has tight control over the media in Ukraine, and his regime also has targeted dissidents against fighting the war. The Gallup survey results released on Monday shows support for fighting the war until it is won has fallen to 60% from 70% last year among Ukrainians. The number of Ukrainians who want to seek a diplomatic resolution has increased from 25 to 31% over the past 12 months. Support for finding an end to the war is strongest in regions where the fighting is ongoing. And so if you'll if you go and follow through my article, click on the Gallup link there, you will see a map of Ukraine in that article where they have the percentages of support by each region of Ukraine. And as you start in the countries that border Poland and move, what would that be, eastward and southward through Ukraine, support for the war steadily decreases, support for negotiations steadily increases, and it looks like to me, over 50%, or at least around the 50% number in the frontline area. So Zaporizhia, Kherson, they didn't poll in the Donbass, they didn't poll in Crimea, which are the Russian-held areas, but also in the east along where the battle lines are now. Ukrainians are increasingly looking for a diplomatic end to this war. Now, that is still 60% opposed or for fighting, and 31% looking for diplomacy, with was 7 to 9%, I guess, that are either undecided or margin of error in there. So the waning approval for fighting comes as Ukraine's summer counteroffensive resulted in substantial casualties and minimal territorial gains. Kiev's Western backers knew the military operations were unlikely to succeed and would result in high casualties. In August, the Washington Post reported that the counteroffensive's failures had blunted Ukrainian morale. The slipping support for Zelensky's pledge to retake the Donbass and Crimea through military means comes as Kiev has tight control over Ukrainian media. Shortly after the start of the war, Zelensky nationalized the media and only allows outlets to operate, including online blogs and everything, with state licenses. Additionally, Ukrainian police have rounded up citizens who expressed dissatisfaction for the war, alleging that they were espousing Russian propaganda. Approval for aiding the war in Ukraine is shrinking in the U.S. as well. Reuters poll found that 41% of Americans support sending more arms to Ukraine, while 35% oppose further military assistance. When the same opinion poll was conducted in May, 46% of Americans bad sending arms, while 29% were opposed. And so those numbers, of course, are a lot more closer in the U.S. than Ukraine. But especially with the Kiev's tight control over the media and opinion in Ukraine, it is interesting that that number has slid so far over the past year, and it's now only 60% of people. And again, you do wonder with Kiev's narrative control, if maybe that is a little bit closer to a 50-50 split or something like that. All right, next up here, Russian official says no plans to alter nuclear test ban. A top Russian diplomat explained that the Kremlin will not abandon its ban on testing nuclear weapons unless the U.S. detonates a nuke first. President Vladimir Putin recently said that Moscow has no need to alter its current nuclear policy. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov on Tuesday said that Moscow's nuclear testing policy will mirror Washington's. He said if the U.S. conducts a nuclear test, then we will be forced to mirror that as well. Russia and the U.S. are both parties to the partial nuclear test ban treaty, an agreement that prohibits nearly all detonations. However, under that treaty, nuclear testing could still occur underground. The testing of nuclear weapons was common during the Cold War, and Washington last conducted an underground nuclear weapons detonation in 1992. I believe that number for Russia or the Soviet Union would be 89 or 90. Members of the Russian State Duma have discussed rescinding Moscow's ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Washington is not a party to that agreement that goes beyond the partial agreement and bars underground nuclear testing as well. Ryabkov said that the U.S. believes that he referring to Russia, will keep turning a blind eye to its failure to ratify the pact. He went on to say that Moscow's future in the agreement depends on Washington joining. He said, we believe that 23 years that we have been waiting for something to change in Washington in terms of ratification are quite significant time for this step to be made. Regrettably, no indications that the U.S. is going to follow this path are visible, and so we have no choice but to balance our position. The Energy Department is preparing to test a nuclear weapon without a detonation. The U.S. is spending $1.8 billion on the Scorpius project, which they hope will be able to use in 2027. This next sentence is one of the most wild things that I have ever written. Scientists call it tickling the dragon's tail because what they plan to do approaches the stage at which nuclear fission of material sustains an ongoing series of chain reactions but remains below the threshold of a nuclear weapon. And so a nuclear explosion, I should say. And I really hope that these people know what they're doing, because this sounds really dangerous. And they use like a cute, cool name like tickling the dragon's tail, like they're doing something important but crazy, and it sounds just expensive and dangerous to me. So after a recent speech, a Russian scholar asked Putin if Russia needed to alter its nuclear doctrine, and I think if you listen to the question, it was kind of phrased in a sense of, given what's going on in the world, the hostilities of the West towards Moscow, do we need to change our nuclear doctrine? And Putin said, I do not see the need to change our conceptual approaches. The potential adversary knows everything and is aware of what we are capable of, Putin explained, adding that Russia will only use a nuclear weapon in retaliation of a nuclear attack or in response to an existential threat. And so that has been Russia's longstanding nuclear policy. One last story here on the Ukraine war. Germany on Tuesday announces a $1.1 billion weapons package for Ukraine that Berlin says was to help Kiev get through the winter. The package includes a U.S.-made Patriot air defense system, 2 German-made IRIS-T air defense systems, 10 more Leopard tanks, and other types of equipment. With this new winter package, we are further enhancing the readiness of the Ukrainian armed forces in the coming months, the German defense minister said. That's Boris Pistorius. The provision of such large arms packages demonstrates that NATO is preparing to support the conflict for another year. In Washington, the White House and Hawks are considering authorizing a giant Ukrainian aid package to get Ukraine through the 2024 election. After initially being reluctant to go all in on the proxy war, Germany has become one of Ukraine's top NATO backers, second to only the United States. According to the German-based Kiel Institute, Berlin has provided Ukraine with about $18 billion in military aid compared to the $44.5 billion provided by the U.S. And so, I mean, just enormous amounts of weaponry that NATO is sending to Ukraine. Now, you know, I wonder if Germany is doing this maybe in anticipation that there may be some lag in U.S. aid going to Ukraine with what's going on in the Congress and the lack of a Ukraine aid bill seeking to go through. But the Biden administration is seeking $100 billion in aid, which I do imagine that they will be able to pass. If maybe the only thing I could think of is that some Republicans might relent on, say, a $24 billion aid package to Ukraine in order to avoid having to pass a $100 billion aid package to Ukraine. So, wild stuff going on here. This one is a little bit of a follow-up onto something we talked about on the show, I believe last week, but maybe on Monday's show. And then also getting into the Israel war. So Senator Schumer lectures on China's response to Israel-Hamas fighting. And so last week we talked about Chuck Schumer leading the first congressional delegation to China in 4 years. And one of the things that Schumer wanted to accomplish on that visit was to help facilitate a meeting between Biden and Xi in November. Now, given some of the things that Chuck Schumer said and did, I'm kind of surprised. I would be a little bit surprised if maybe not that the meeting happens. I'm not sure if he did that much, but if he essentially failed in that mission of helping to encourage and to facilitate it. So Schumer told the Chinese leader on Monday, according to Bloomberg, "I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn the cowardly and vicious attacks upon them. I say this with respect, but I was disappointed by the foreign minister's statement showing no sympathy or his support for the Israeli people during these tragedies." And this seems to be one of the just absolutely unbelievably stupid diplomatic bungles that have happened during the Biden administration. Now, granted, Schumer is the Senate Majority Leader, so you would assume that kind of his role as an establishment Democrat and the Senate Majority Leader, that he is essentially in lockstep with the White House on foreign policy. Maybe there's some differences here and there, but Schumer going to China with the potential of Biden meeting with Xi next month, I think signals that this was supposed to be a diplomatic trip, and that Schumer should have kept his mouth shut on this. And so now, look, it doesn't matter if China says that we condemn Hamas. Hamas doesn't care, right? Like, they carried out their attack because they're facing an enormously oppressive situation in Gaza, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So this just seems like another absolute diplomatic blunder to me, to lecture China on something that really doesn't matter what the Chinese statement says. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, "We call on all relevant parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, and immediately end the hostilities to protect civilians and avoid further deterioration of the situation." On Monday, after Schumer met with Xi, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman offered a stronger condemnation of the killing of civilians. They said, "We're deeply saddened by the civilian casualties and oppose and condemn the harm of civilians." So Schumer took credit for this, saying that it was because of what he said that happened. But again, I have to imagine that having the Senate Majority Leader going to China and then lecturing the Chinese president about some nuance in a statement that doesn't really involve China. Now, China does, have interest in Israel and the Middle East. They have suggested that they could potentially be a party to broker some kind of agreement in Israel. And I guess Beijing has had some success recently in the Middle East with the agreement that they negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Iran. At the same time, I really don't think that, adding or retracting this statement opposing civilian harm was really worth lecturing the Chinese president over, and certainly wasn't worth Schumer coming out and, claiming that he kind of strong-armed China into making a stronger statement. I think that particular taking it public park will also not sit well with China. Schumer also ended his delegation to China early over the situation in Israel for, I guess, whatever reason. He felt like he needed to be in Washington to help facilitate the passing of an aid bill for Israel or something like that. And as I mentioned on the last show, there is now talk of combining Israeli and a Ukrainian aid bill into one, which I guess they figure will force the likes of, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some other Zionists in Congress who oppose aid to Ukraine but approve aid to Israel to go ahead and sign off on one to get the other. I'm not sure if that strategy is going to work, but that does seem to be the current strategy and what they're looking at going forward. All right, now let's talk about what's going on in Israel. And I mean, it's all terrible. The first thing is I want to look real quick at what kind of the U.S. is doing here. And initially, I kind of got the idea that, this was reading between the lines of what does Israel want from the U.S. Of course, they want military aid. But what I think they're really seeking is basically not to be told no publicly from the U.S. on anything. And it seems like they're getting this. So this from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, October 9th. Blinken deletes tweet encouraging ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Secretary of State Antony Blinken deleted a tweet where he said he was encouraging efforts to push for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Blinken made the post on X after he spoke with the Turkish foreign minister on Saturday. He said, "I encourage Turkey's advocacy for a ceasefire and release of all hostages held by Hamas immediately." The State Department's readout of the call did not mention the ceasefire, but said Blinken encouraged Turkey's continued engagement and highlighted the United States' unwavering focus on halting the attacks by Hamas and securing the release of all hostages. And so again, here we have Blinken putting out a tweet and deleting it that called for, a de-escalation. So the State Department's U.S. Office of Palestinian Affairs also deleted a tweet calling for restraint and de-escalation. It said, "We unequivocally condemn the attack of Hamas terrorists and the loss of life that has occurred. We encourage all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solve nothing." And so, even that was apparently too pro-Hamas to even suggest that restraint or increasing violence wasn't the right solution. So this seems to be, to me, the Biden administration completely allowing Israel to take the gloves off. I guess it's unclear what it will look like if the death toll for the Palestinians, say, starts approaching six figures or something like that. If we're talking about tens of thousands of dead children, maybe then there will be some political pressure building for the White House to make a statement saying that this isn't great. But I don't think we're going to see that publicly, at least not for some time here. And the White House is really just going to greenlight Israel and whatever they want to do. And also, we're going to give Israel military support, and the $3.8 billion in military support we give Israel every year has been crucial to allowing Israel to establish its apartheid state and oppress the Palestinians in the way that they have. All right, so next up here, U.S. Israeli lawmakers call for genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. This one, Dave DeCamp, October 10th, antiwar.com. Lawmakers in the U.S. and Israel have called for the mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza in response to the Hamas attack on southern Israel that has killed at least 1,000 Israelis so far. By the way, I'm recording on Wednesday morning. Dave wrote this Tuesday night, and I believe that as of this morning, the Israeli death toll has officially crossed 1,200, and the Palestinian death toll has crossed 1,000. So, let's see. A member of the Israeli Knesset, Tali Gottlieb, and a member of the Likud party called for called for Israel to use its nuclear weapons, which Israel has never formally acknowledged exist. Jericho missile, strategic alert. Before considering the introduction of forces, doomsday weapon. This is my opinion. May God preserve all of our strength, he wrote on X on Monday. So in another, a woman. In another post, she urged Israel to use its doomsday weapons and everything in its arsenal. The following day, she continued to call for a massive strike on Gaza, which is home to 2 million people, about half of whom are children. And so, something else that's important there that we could just flesh out a little bit more here is Israel, and even the U.S. doesn't acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. And this is really important because Israel doesn't have a legal nuclear weapons program. They have an illicit one. And by U.S. law, we're not supposed to be giving military aid and military support to countries that have undeclared and illegal nuclear weapons programs. And yet we give, up until recently, more military aid to Israel than any other country. Now, obviously, that's been eclipsed by at least Ukraine, if not also Taiwan, although maybe Israel will move back at least into the number 2 slot once they get another tranche of U.S. aid coming in, which I do expect will happen at some point here. So let's see. She wrote in another post on X, only an explosion that shakes the Middle East will restore this country's dignity, strength, and security. It's time to kiss doomsday, shooting powerful missiles without limit, not flattening a neighborhood, crushing and flattening Gaza without mercy. Over in the U.S., Senator Marco Rubio also called for the mass slaughter of Gaza. CNN's Jay Tapper asked Rubio, is there a way for Israel to destroy Hamas without causing mass casualties against the people of Gaza? There are more than 2 million people in Gaza, and roughly half of them are children. Rubio replied, yeah, I don't think there's any way that Israel can be expected to coexist or find some diplomatic off-ramp with these savages. I mean, these people, as you've been reporting and as others have seen, have deliberately targeted teenage girls, women, children, and the elderly, just horrifying things, and I don't think we know the full extent of it yet. I mean, there is more to come in the days and weeks ahead. You can't exist. They have to be eradicated. In an apparent reference to civilian casualties, Rubio continued, and you point out the difficult challenges. This is going to be incredibly painful. This is going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to be horrifying, the price to pay. But even more horrifying is allowing a group like this to continue to be a viable group operating in a space that they control. I wish, in an ideal world, people would tell you that there is, but I don't see any other option. It's a terrible option, but it remains the only option. And, this certainly isn't limited to these two people. I have seen, especially from, non-elected Americans, but on the political right and even the left, just regular calls for the complete eradication of Gaza, turning it into glass, turning it into a parking lot, just absolutely no recognition that there's 2 million people that live there. People saying that they would give the people of Gaza, the 2 million people of Gaza, that to have an hour to leave, right? Can you imagine in any realistic scenario anywhere in the world that you would give 2 million people anything less than like a month to evacuate a place like Gaza if you really wanted the, civilians to be able to leave in any kind of orderly, non-mob chaos way? But yeah, people are saying, give the civilians an hour to leave, 12 hours to leave, an hour to leave, and then you could commence a carpet bombing of the whole place because anybody who's left is just there because they support Gaza. Of course, during that time, the one border crossing that Gaza has with the country that isn't Israel, the Egyptian one, was attacked by Israel. So, there are even issues to the idea that the Gazan people could evacuate towards Egypt, not just because of the Egyptian policies, but because of the Israeli strikes as well. And I'll also, just throw out here and put in a disclaimer. There are people that are, kind of surprisingly, really, I would say, supporting the Hamas attacks. If you're looking for justifications, I think that could be a problem. However, I do understand there's some people, that oppressed people do have a right to fight back against their, the people who oppress them. And in this case, Israel is an apartheid state, and the people of Gaza are as oppressed or more oppressed than anyone else on the planet. When you could figure how the Israeli government puts them on a starvation diet to make sure they had the minimal number of calories possible, not to cause a humanitarian crisis, but also not enough to really thrive in any kind of way. That if you look at how Hamas came to power in Gaza, with the elections that were, Gaza last held elections in 2016. And so if you consider that half the population there is under the age of 18, it's pretty clear that half of the people in Gaza, even if every single person voted in Gaza, half the people in Gaza have never voted for or given any kind of official endorsement to Hamas. Additionally, those elections were split between Hamas and Fatah, and it was only after the West and Israel backed Fatah and tried to weaponize them and arm them and help them defeat Hamas, and Hamas went to war and won and captured all the weapons, did Hamas even seize control of Gaza in the first place. And so, everybody says that, well, because the people of Gaza elected Hamas, then that's an endorsement of Hamas. And so for that reason, all their lives are forfeit and could be taken at any second by the Israeli government. And living under these conditions are certainly so horrific. You do hear people from Gaza say that the reason people fight is because it's better to, die on your feet than to live in the way the people of Gaza are subjected to live. And, certainly some of these positions are understandable, and I don't think it makes what Hamas did right in any way. But people, saying that they have some understanding of what Hamas did, I do see where they're coming from in that perspective. Now, there are people who are, actually going all the way to, I would call, celebrate what Hamas did, and that's just messed up. When you look at the number of civilians that were killed in the Hamas attack, there clearly could have been some more discerning targets picked by Hamas. I don't want to say that every Hamas rocket has to hit a military target, or else this is just a terror group firing indiscriminately on civilians, and this needs to be condemned. Like, not going that far, that's a ridiculous standard. However, things like attacking the music festival and the number of people that were killed there, certainly suggest that Hamas is not the most moral group. And, there are parts of this that do need to be denounced and condemned. So, just want to point that out. That I saw, like, the BLM Chicago Twitter account put out a tweet, like, kind of glorifying the Hamas paratroopers that did attack that festival. And so, it's very important to have some nuance and talk about this in a very delicate way, and not do anything that signals outright support for Hamas. Now, I also need to mention that there's a lot of conflation about support for Palestinians and support for Hamas. I see nothing wrong with people going out and rallying and, waving Palestinian flags and everything like that. The Palestinians are subject to absolutely brutal treatment. It's almost ignored 1,000% of the time. And so the one time that Israel Palestine are at the top of the headlines in the news, I think it's probably important for Palestinians and supporters of Palestine to go out and to say, like, hey, wave their flags and say we support Palestine, and say we support Palestine because of the Israeli ethnic cleansing campaign against the Palestinian people. Very important points to make. I understand why people are making those. I just think, do your best to separate the Palestinian people from especially the nefarious actions, the really ugly actions of Hamas. All right. So we have a couple articles here that are very interesting. I'm going to start with this one first. Both are from Dave DeCamp. Egypt says Israel ignored warnings that something big was coming. An Egyptian intelligence official has said that Israel ignored warnings that something big was coming, and amid questions about how the Hamas attack that was launched on Saturday took the Israeli government by surprise, considering Gaza is under constant Israeli surveillance. And Israel has a lot of military capabilities around the Gaza Strip. If you remember back to 2018 with the Great March of Return, maybe that was 2019, with the Great March of Return, there were a lot of those military capabilities were on display as Palestinians walked towards the prison fence of Gaza with their hands in the air. They were routinely shot, and Israel had sophisticated technology to detect anyone getting near the fence, and they were able to shoot and neutralize all of them. And so, watching a smoking and ill-functioning Palestinian bulldozer take down the Israeli prison fence there was just interesting to see, because you would assume there would be an Israeli sniper, an Israeli machine gun position, or something within range of where that bulldozer is to neutralize it well before it ever got to the fence, much less, allow it to sit there and destroy it for minutes on end. So there are several things, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole yet of this was some kind of false flag operation, or maybe not a false flag, but Israel turned a blind eye, allowed this to happen to some extent, and maybe Israel didn't think it would go this far, that this many people would die, but that Tel Aviv kind of assessed, Netanyahu, the prime minister, assessed that a crisis would be good to allow some kind of Hamas attack to happen, to rally this kind of just feverish support, where there's all these people calling the Palestinians animals, and that they need to be put down like rabid dogs and stuff like that. So propaganda wise, this was a pretty big win for Tel Aviv. And again, that doesn't, that it didn't make 9/11, that it didn't make George Bush do 9/11, or even that the, by a Bush administration intentionally let 9/11 happen. However, given that Israel should have had systems in place to prevent this attack from happening, and the Egyptians are saying that they gave Israel warning beforehand, it does raise questions as to how this attack was as successful as it was. So there's also been a lot of, I don't want to say reports, it's just mindless speculation, but coming from all aspects of the American media, saying that, well, this doesn't seem like something that the Hamas could do on their own, so I'm sure the Iranians were involved somehow. And on Monday, Israeli officials said they had no evidence that Iran was involved in the Hamas attack on southern Israel, after a report from the Wall Street Journal claimed Iranian officials helped plot the operation. We have no evidence or proof that Iran was involved, the IDF spokesperson said. They left open the possibility that Tehran was linked to the attack, saying just because you don't have that evidence doesn't necessarily mean that Iran isn't behind it. And so, look, I'm sure there is probably some connection, at least to some Iranians, and some of the weaponry that Hamas has. However, that I mean is far different than actually helping Hamas to conduct this specific attack. And also, I'm sure that probably most other Middle Eastern countries have, some rich people who support the Palestinians, and some of that money ends up going to Hamas, and some of that money ends up going to fund Hamas's military. Right. I'm sure all this is going on. So if they really want to find some connections, maybe they could. But I think Israel is probably speaking to the fact that this wasn't a coordinated plot by Iran, but rather something that originated in Hamas. At least, that seems to be what I'm understanding. So we also, and I should also note here that I am quite concerned that there is going to be a real expansion of this war to other countries in the Middle East. And it could be, very small, some exchange of fire between southern Lebanon, either Palestinian groups or Hezbollah with the IDF. Or it could be, just Israel bombing Syria at a little bit of an increased frequency, or, I mean, this really could expand into a war between Hezbollah and Israel. The U.S. could potentially get involved then. Iran could potentially get involved then. But, once I think you're looking at the war expanding to war between Hezbollah and Israel, then it's just a matter of time before the U.S. gets involved. This is, I think, because of the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria that you operate in areas where American troops operate. And in fact, in Iraq, they are, in a lot of ways, allies with the Americans. They certainly were in the fight against the Islamic State. And so I think the American soldiers in the Middle East are in a real terrible position if this war expands any further, and their lives could really be in jeopardy very quickly, especially those again in Iraq and Syria should this war expand. So I think this is a real concern. It's hard to see how it's going to de-escalate, especially as Israel is preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza, which Hamas has said that will draw a larger response from them. All right, so next up, some more statements from the IDF. The Israeli defense minister on Monday announced a complete siege of Gaza and said Israeli forces were fighting human animals as Israeli airstrikes have been bombing the enclave, which is home to about 1 million children. I have ordered a complete siege of the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we will act accordingly, including to the Israeli Defense Ministry, I believe, spokesperson. So also on Monday, Hamas warned it would start executing Israeli captives as taken to Gaza if Israel does not stop airstrikes. According to Middle East Eye, the spokesperson for the military wing of Hamas said prisoners were currently safe and sound, but they are being forced to act due to Israelis' airstrikes on civilians. He said that if the bombings did not stop, civilian prisoners would be killed and the executions would be documented. I mean, this is horrible. I really hope, Hamas doesn't take that step. Of course, the Israeli airstrikes are also horrible. I might have been off. I had thought that Gaza or Hamas had taken between 200 and 300 Israeli prisoners. The reports now put that number between 130 and 150. And as far as I understand it, they haven't started conducting any executions yet. So that's the update there. All right, so next up here, this from October 10th, reporting on the border crossing. This is the Rafa border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, and it has been closed off as Palestinians have nowhere to flee amid relentless Israeli airstrikes that started in response to a Hamas attack on southern Israel. The Israeli military on Tuesday revised its recommendation for Palestinians to get out through the Rafa crossing into Israel. This is from the Office of Spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel in the IDF. Clarification: the Rafa crossing was open yesterday, but is now closed. The New Arab report that Egyptian officials said the crossing was closed off indefinitely. The crossing will be closed off indefinitely for the situation has become quite dangerous after the Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip has impacted the Egyptian side of the crossing, an Egyptian security source said. Another source said Egypt was trying to ensure no one attempts to infiltrate Palestinians into Egypt can take place. And according to Israel's Channel 13, Israel has threatened Egypt it would bomb Egyptian aid trucks if they are headed into Gaza. According to the Red Crescent, 3 Israeli airstrikes hit the Rafa border crossing within 24 hours after the Israeli defense minister announced a complete siege of Gaza, which involved cutting off food, water, electricity, and fuel. An Israeli major general, the head of the Israeli military agency in charge of policies in the West Bank and Gaza, said on Tuesday that the Israeli was turning Gaza into hell. Kidnapping, abusing, and murdering children, women, the elderly is not human. There is no justification for that. Hamas turned into ISIS and the residents of Gaza into being appalled. Or there will be no. All right. The residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. So he's saying that the people of Gaza are celebrating the Hamas attack, and that's how you know they're all animals. So sorry, I struggled with that quote just a little bit there. So these claims that Hamas is ISIS was really bolstered and amplified yesterday after there was I just call it short-lived report that the Israeli soldiers had found about 40 beheaded Israeli babies, obviously claiming that the Hamas did it during their attack. This was reported by one member of the Israeli press that was traveling with the Israeli military. And if you just look at the report, I don't know, the woman didn't seem as upset as she should have been reporting what she was claiming to report. And later the IDF came out and said that they could not confirm the report. So that kind of suggested to me that this is probably not true and was just some propaganda. Next up here, Netanyahu tells Biden we have to go into Gaza, rules out negotiations. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told President Biden in a phone call on Sunday that Israel has to launch a ground invasion into the besieged Gaza Strip and ruled out the idea of negotiations. We have to go in, we can't negotiate now, Netanyahu told Biden, according to the U.S. and Israeli sources. On the same day, U.S. officials told the media that they expect Israel to launch an invasion within 48 hours. The report said President Biden did not press Netanyahu or try to convince him not to go through with the ground invasion, as the U.S. has shown no interest in calling for de-escalation. And earlier we mentioned that Secretary of State Antony Blinken deleted a tweet encouraging Turkish efforts to set up a ceasefire. Since the Sunday Biden-Netanyahu phone call, Israel announced it called up 30,000 reservists in order to complete Siege of Gaza, and they said they were fighting human animals in the enclave, which is populated by over 2 million people, including about 1 million children. Israel also kept up relentless airstrikes in Gaza since Hamas launched its attack on Saturday. Since the Hamas attack was launched on Saturday, nearly 2,000 people have been killed, and again, these numbers are a little bit higher, but my estimates as of this morning are 1,000 Palestinians and 1,200 Israelis. President Biden delivered a speech on Tuesday affirming his full support for the Israeli military operations. And so even as, at least 100 Palestinian children have been killed so far, Biden is announcing, we stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. So this is just insane. The U.S. offered Israel support for extracting hostages from Gaza. This comes as no surprise to me, as some of the hostages are American, so it would make sense that the White House would want some place in, forming the military operations to free the civilians from Gaza, especially as Israel has indicated that they are not going to not bomb Gaza out of concern of killing civilians. And so, this is kind of interesting. I have seen people say that there are reports that there are U.S. Special Forces operators on the ground, and I have to imagine that at least in some circumstances that these Special Forces operators are working with Israel on the hostage situation, although that doesn't mean that they're not doing other things as well, or couldn't be involved in the fighting in the future. Last up here, U.S. might send second aircraft carrier to support Israel. The U.S. might deploy a second aircraft carrier to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea to support Israel's attack on Gaza, two Pentagon officials told Politico on Tuesday. And this adds to my fear that this is going to be a wider war. I wouldn't imagine that the U.S. really needs to send another aircraft carrier to the Middle East just to aid Tel Aviv in killing Palestinians in Gaza. I imagine at most Israel will need U.S. aid to accomplish that, like, more weapons or something like that, but certainly wouldn't need, the support from another American aircraft carrier. Maybe there's some spy planes or capabilities like that they want to get access to, but it's hard for me to imagine they really need two aircraft carriers plus Tel Aviv and the Israeli military to fight against Gaza. It would seem like Israel probably has the military capabilities to do that, maybe with some weapon shipments from the U.S. And so I would expect that Washington sees this as a message to Iran not to get involved in the fight. But again, could also just be in preparation for a wider war. If Israel goes to war with Hezbollah, I would imagine that the U.S. would get involved in that point. And Israel may even need, really U.S. assistance at that point. And so this could spiral into a massive, massive confrontation very soon. I'm very concerned about this. And, anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning into the show today. I will definitely have more on Russia, on Israel, with the last show of the week that will come out on Friday. Thank you all.